What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and you're listening to the Homebrewed Christianity podcast, where we bring you some of the most zesty, tasty theological treats in the audiological form to explode up in your imagination, so you can brew a tasty, zesty faith. Yeah, today on the podcast, you're going to get to hear from a stack of theologians. Though they were alive, they weren't dead. It's not books. You're going to get to hear from Cindy Rigby, Barbara Holmes, Amos Yong, Tom Oord, Keith Ward, Adam Clark, and there's probably even more. There's like a bunch of them. They were all hanging out at the Hatchery in Los Angeles during the Enfolding Theology Conference. And during the conference, we had some amazing, amazing conversations. And my friend of the podcast, and regular voice of our sponsor, Phillips Theological Seminary, Josh Linton was in the house. And in the evenings, we had some soirees. Like, what better way to spend your evening after a theology event than some people outside around a fire, roasting marshmallows and junk. Some people hanging out in our lounge. Others packed into my office, enjoying some beverages. Why Josh asked the same questions to a series of different theologians, and you'll be able to compare and contrast all the different answers he got. It's really sweet, and when you do, you'll not only be hearing some amazing theologians' short, pithy, direct answers to things, but you'll also get to hear Josh. And Josh is the head of promotion recruiting, letting people know of the types of theological education that Phillips Theological Seminary offers in Tulsa, Oklahoma, online and all that junk. So you hear about them regularly on the podcast because they love Homebrewed and sponsor it. And now you get to hear from him in his voice. And when you hear him, you'll be like, oh, I think I can talk to him about theological education and my questions about the school. Because, listen, he just sat down and talked to these amazing theologians, asked some cool questions. So, this is a special edition, a comparative theological endeavor of a host of legendary theologians that were here in Redondo Beach at the Hatchery, and is sponsored by our most faithful sponsor, and he's a really cool representative, Josh Linton from Phillips Theological Seminary. So go to the website, homebrewedchristianity.com, and you can find out more info about all the different theologians you just heard, and click through and find out more about Phillips Theological Seminary. Oh yeah. And don't forget deacons. We're getting close to May. And in May, first Monday of May, we have a deacons meeting. That's right. That's when Tony and I are going to sit down and talk to 3 different theologians about 3 different topics. If you're a member of the Homebrewed Christianity community, you're an alkalite, a deacon, you're an elder, a bishop. If you've gone to homebrewedcommunity.com and joined up, supporting, donating every month, being a part of the secret Facebook group, if you're a part of that, then you're going to get invited. You're going to get a heads up on our 3 guests. You're going to know the topics. You're going to send in questions. We'll do back-to-back mini interviews and engagements. We'll ask your questions, let you pop on and ask them yourself if you want to, via video live streaming classroom. You can also send in topics for Tony and I to argue about, because Tony Jones and I like arguing, and even if I don't know the topic or my position, I know I'm right and he's wrong. You hear that, TJ? Dr. Jones? Yeah, taunts. Oh, and speaking of taunting, on May 3rd, we're having a podcast battle, a live podcast on a secret roof in Malibu. We have guests that are coming. Yeah, N.T. Wright's going to be there. Greg Boyd's going to be there. Richard Beck's going to be there. There's going to be a lot of fun stuff. But here's the main thing. It's a podcast battle between me and Luke's podcast. Luke, what is his podcast name? I can't even seem to remember. I keep forgetting his podcast name. It's Luke Norsworthy, but his podcast name is just not even, it's not even a newsworthy name. I can't Oh, yeah, you're right. His podcast name is Luke's Almost as Good as a Homebrewed Christianity Podcast. Maybe that was his name. I don't know. It depends on how straightforward your advertising is. But anyway, we're gonna have a battle of the podcast. Luke's not so newsworthy podcast is going to be there. We're going to battle it out. I don't even know exactly how we're battling because I have a list of ideas. But we're going to battle. We'll settle things. NT Wright will be there. We're going to talk about Demon. It's the release of Richard Beck's brand new book. And he's wanting to bring demons back for progressive Christians. What's up with that? It's going to be on a cliff in Malibu. So if you're in the Los Angeles area and want to have some fun, join us May 3rd if there are tickets left. And, yeah. Who doesn't want to take a selfie with NT Wright on a rooftop in Malibu? It's just, some people want to do that. I want to destroy Luke and his, what's his, Luke's podcast. Yep, I'm going to destroy him. You hear that, Luke? Oh, yeah, that's right. He's been talking junk on Twitter. You should get on Twitter and tell him what's up. Tell him he's just going down. Tell him he better not challenge me to a cornhole game. What's up, Luke? You hear that? Yeah. All right. This is a podcast. Homebrewed Christianity Podcast. Special edition. Josh, Linton, Phillips Theological Seminary, talking to a whole host of theologians. Get ready. Boom.
I'm Josh Linton. I'm Director of Recruitment at Phillips Theological Seminary. We sponsor the Homebrewed Christianity Podcast quite a bit and sponsoring this segment. So Tripp said, hey, why don't you ask the smart people that we're going to have at Enfolding Theology some questions about theological education? And I said, okay, I'll do that. And that's what we're going to do. And then I think there's some other questions that you're going to have to answer. A lot of what I do is listen to prospective students, right, and tell their stories, and they say what they're thinking. And some aren't a fit for Phillips and what we do, and some are, but we have a lot of conversation. And so the three questions that I'm asking have been sort of distilled from what I hear a lot about. But the first one, though, is just something I was interested in. As theologians, and I think prospective students would want to know about this, why do you do what you do? And listen, I don't want to, I'm called to this and this is what God, why do you do what you do? I think that's an important question to ask a theologian who is doing work that sometimes people look at and go, where's the return on investment in that type of work? So I'm interested to hear what each of you have to say.
I can start, I guess. There's a lot of things, a lot of ways to do theology, a lot of ways to do theological education. There's a lot of components to theology. I happen to be a constructive theologian and do a lot with philosophy, historical theology, and try to wrap things together. A driving force for me is the quest to try to come up with some kind of plausible answers to the biggest questions in life, to the biggest whys. And I'm drawn toward the questions that are most vexing, some of them the most controversial, but often the ones that people are most interested in. Jesus said, people can't live by bread alone. And I think these kinds of questions not only invigorate me as a theologian, I think they are questions almost everybody wrestles to, although it's in varying degrees.
Okay, I'll jump in because I'm atypical. I mean, I've always been a university teacher, so that's it. I'm an academic. I was ordained later on, and I was in England. You can get ordained. It's a funny place. You can get ordained to your academic job. Okay, so you don't have to have a church, or you don't have to do that. So being ordained was a witness, an active witness on my part, but it didn't change my job. So I was always in a university context. And the reason I got ordained then was because when I became a Christian, I thought I don't want to preach in my philosophy lectures. So if I wear a dog collar, which I don't anymore, but if I did, then people would see at least I believe something. So that was the context in which I worked, and I found that invited a lot of hostility. And so since then, my life is one of being constant argument with other academics. So that's the life in which, the context in which my life has been lived. And so it is a privileged environment. Academics aren't rich, of course, but they're isolated from a lot of the troubles of the world, really. And in that sense, it is ivory towerish. But on the other hand, they're real academic questions, and you've got to face. So I see my vocation, if I can call it that, as making a space for Christian faith in a context which is very hostile to it in many ways. And so I'm ashamed that it's lived in the ivory halls of Oxford, and in fact the college I'm in is Hogwarts School. I don't know if you know that. Christchurch College in Oxford is actually Hogwarts School in the films. It's a terrible place to be. But
we'll edit that part out.
Right. Yeah. Right.
But okay. So I'm in that context where I'm stuck. I'm in a job which raises questions about religion by its nature, and even the fact of my job being Regius Professor of Divinity means people take me to stand for what they think is a very conservative and patriarchal form of religious faith. So the best I can do then is to say, I tried not to be patriarchal. I try not to do that. But I think that's the only way I can live out my own life. And it's a very small part of the whole Christian system. So that's why I'm very empathetic to what's being said. I think, but that's probably not my vocation, but I do want to support it and encourage young people to be sure that they're aware of it as much as possible.
Wow, I feel a deep sense of calling, and which led me really trying to express, my passion and love through an expression of justice. And I find that the route toward trying to create a just world is through kind of being an activist intellectual. The activism feeds the intellectualism. The intellectual work, labor feeds the activist practice. And it's kind of a dialectic that goes back and forth. They feed each other. And I've recently just tried to add a kind of contemplative moment to really balance it all out, in exploring practices of mindfulness and interiority, which I've always kind of played with, but I think at this moment it's going to have to be a deeper role in my life, and I think it should be something that the church really re-embraces, because so much of what social justice have meant has been trying to free people from external restraints. But what I'm starting to see now is that we have internal restraints that we don't have a disciplined way of getting at. So how do we, in Augustinian terms, if we take like capitalism or consumerism, it's actually like a soul craft. It shapes our souls in certain ways that our desire or loves are ordered in ways that do not serve justice. And I think these ancient disciplines, reapplying them for our contemporary moment, could be a way of reordering our souls and our loves and our passions in ways that actually makes us persons for others.
Thank you.
I think that I'm a theologian because I always have been. I know that's a funny thing to say, but when I was a kid, my dad, we studied the Bible a lot. So anytime something happened in church, we keep talking about it. We come home and my dad would get the Bible out. We look at texts together, talk together. So I was sort of encouraged to, and I love to do that with my dad, to think through things and even argue about things and even be critical of what happened in the church. But what was, motivating all that, energizing all that was this idea, this belief, this conviction that if what we believed meant anything, it couldn't mean something only for us personally, but had to make a difference in the world. And I take that to be kind of the real definition of evangelical, that you believe that God's word is transforms lives and is for everyone. It's for the whole world, and it'll transform the life of the world. It's not about, I'm very progressive socially on social issues, and I hate the fact that the word evangelical has been sort of captured by people who take certain political stands. And so I went to college and became president of InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, which was a step way to the left of my upbringing.
Wow.
Okay. Yes.
Wow.
I mean, I saw my friends were drinking beer and I called home. It was a crisis. I was at Brown University, which was a big step out for my parents to allow me to go there. Very conservative upbringing. And to their credit, they sent me there. But so I became president of InterVarsity, and it split the chapter because there were people who thought that I shouldn't be president because I was a woman. And so that, why did I keep doing this? Well, I at the time thought women shouldn't be ordained, but I had these gifts that just kept kind of playing out step at a time. So it was first my dad, but then what happened is the community of faith, kept kind of, seeing one step ahead of me. So in a way, I mean, the InterVarsity people who stayed in, I wasn't campaigning to be president. They saw certain gifts in me, and so they elected me, and then some people left. But then, later on in my life, after I already had a job in hand, so this is about, 1994, I was headed off to go to teach at Austin Seminary, and I was in New Jersey. I was a pastor in this church. I was not ordained, but I was a student kind of pastor while I did my PhD, again, because I loved the church. We were working in this church, my husband and I. And one day, the women in this group that I had, a women's group, they actually did an intervention. They stayed after this women's club, and they said to me, Cindy, how do you get ordained? And I knew the whole process because I was already teaching and stuff. And I said, well, first you have to become a member of a church. And I was a member of my dad's Baptist church still back home. Anyway, I became a member of that church that Sunday because these women said, that's it. You're going to become a member. And in 6 months, we're taking you under care. This is all the Presbyterian process. And I was ordained in that church. So as a professor, it wasn't good enough, for me just to be a theologian. I was also called to be a minister of Oord and Sacrament, and so I could go down from the pulpit and break the bread, and so I could lay hands on the students after at their ordinations, that I could lay hands on my own students. So it's just who I always have been. Yeah.
When I was in grad school studying theology, I began to figure out that the words Pentecostal and theology didn't really go together. And what's gotten me up now every morning for the last 25 years is trying to make them go together.
Nice.
I want to reinvigorate the prophetic church. It changed my life. I'm influenced by Bonhoeffer and the Confessing Church. I'm influenced by those people who stood and spoke into the lives of others. And so in seminary education, you have the opportunity to ignite a spark that will not go out. And that is the future of the church.
Well, thank you. So the second question will build on this a little bit. The case for theological education is getting tougher. I'm finding that as a recruiter. Why do this? Why do I want to do this? We just recently rolled out a Master's of Arts in Social Justice. And a lot of the questions that people are asking us are, I want some grant writing courses. I want some of these things that are more practical, hands-on. Why is a seminary doing a course in social justice work? And sort of my pat answer has been, and I think it's sort of the foundation of what helped develop it, was that so many of the injustices that people in society and American culture are experiencing are undergirded by particular views and ideas that are religious or biblical in nature. So one of the works of social justice is then to deconstruct some of those views that are upholding some of these injustices and be able to counter with an alternative view of Christianity or faith or however one lives out and practices that view. So the religious aspect, the religious conversation within social justice work is critical, especially in a place like Oklahoma where we live, and so much of the injustices are happening are because people believe and have a certain faith that's very fundamentalist in nature. So the question is, how would you then, knowing why you do what you do, but then make the case for theological education to someone else who's considering it, but wondering why? Why would I give myself over to hours of study, research, writing, those sort of things that seem so theoretical when I really want to go do work, but still feels this sort of tug at, this call to work in the theology, or to make the theology do the work, so to speak. So what would be your answer, or how would you make the case for theological education?
Because you can do things better if you've thought about them before you start doing them.
I hope that gets in there in the editing.
Yeah. Can there be a mic drop?
Right, yeah. Boom.
Well, here's another way to make the case. We being Christians are told that we're supposed to love God with our heart, our soul, and our mind. And theological education is a way of loving God with your mind, right? Training your mind to love God. And part of that is actually through learning a story, right? Like, we're in a place where the stories, our contemporary stories, are breaking down, and there's no story to hold communities together. So whatever new story we're going to do is going to have to come out of literacy of the old stories. And what theological education does, it introduces you to stories that have been seen as closed, but now we're starting to see these are open texture stories. And we have to actually reinvent or reapply and know these symbols so that we can actually come up with a new story that's going to house our desires and our passions in ways that can make us grow together instead of go fall apart.
Oh, wow, thanks.
It's leadership training. Grace Lee Boggs, who passed away at 100 a few months ago, said, don't train for a profession if you go into theological education. Prepare yourself to lead. Prepare yourself to solve problems. Prepare yourselves to enter a conflicted world and make it better. That's why you go to seminary education.
Yeah, I like that. We have a Master's of Arts Social Justice that is brand new, and people are like, why social justice in a seminary? There's lots of master's degrees in social work, lots of nonprofit leadership master's degrees, and I always tell students or prospective students, because so many of the injustices that exist in society are upheld by religious narratives that are misguided, that need to be critiqued or challenged or disentangled from some of the things that are holding these things together. So the religious piece of this, or the theological piece of this, is very important. And so I like what you say. It's leadership is born out of a theological effort. So when people just decide to think through some of this stuff, they're going to learn how to think through how to live together with other people in a way that makes space for everybody.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, thanks for that answer.
I think the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, but wisdom has to go on growing, and education is what makes it grow. And the more you learn about the ways of God, which means a lot of hard work, really, to look at how God has been working in the world, so history, how the Bible was put together, so languages and the biblical hermeneutical study. These things, I think, are prayers. And as when you read the Bible, you can see this as a prayer. And I think when you're doing theology, you can think about this as prayer, because you're thinking in the presence of God and you're praying that you might get a small part of divine wisdom, some shadow or reflection of it, and that takes hard work, and that's theological education, I would say, is the pursuit of wisdom. That's why I think philosophy, the love of wisdom, is actually theology, so the love of God.
Can I add one more thing?
Absolutely.
I really think that the religiously unaffiliated, the so-called nuns, are wishing that we talked with a little more depth. You know, and so we really need to clear a space and work harder at this. And by depth, I mean, a lot of nuns, have tried church, and they go, and a lot of the duns too, and want to hear something meaningful, and, to get up in this world and say something in a 20-minute period in a sermon or in or teach a class, that's meaningful, you really have to actually put in some time and energy, and to do that, you have to create space for it. So our whole culture, I mean, this question is not just about theological education.
Right.
It's about education, period. It's about liberal arts education. It's about thinking. Thinking has really gone out of vogue, creating spaces to think. And, we're just glutted with everything infringing even, on our intellectual space and our heart space too. And, it's time to take it back. So,
Right.
And theological education can lead in that, I think.
Because it seems like the market and the capitalism, that sort of how it shapes thought is there needs to be a return on investment, and people don't see the thinking returning any to your investment, which theological education says, yeah, it does. It's shaping the world to make room for more people.
Yeah. The world is a transaction. Everything's about transaction. We're about grace, and grace is not a transaction.
Well, I guess for me, why theological education? Because one is interested somehow or other in theos, God. And what does that mean? And so, programmatically, we can be given opportunities in theological education to think about the big questions in terms of God and God's relationship to the world and us, then channeled in various directions. So maybe a program in social justice, or maybe a program of interpreting scripture, or whatever the case may be. But for me, fundamentally, it's, if we somehow have been grasped by God, or somehow find ourselves wondering or challenged by the God reality or the God idea, then theological education gives us the opportunity to press as far deeply into that as we need to and want to.
Wow.
I sometimes talk with potential students who have this question, and they're the kind of people who are really eager to make a difference in the world. And sometimes they're a part of some ministry or some church or some outreach, and they say, man, there's a great need here, and I'm really enjoying what I'm doing. Why should I take some time and do some studies? I mean, I need to give my life to it right now. And I had a professor when I was younger who used an analogy of filling up your gas tank. If you just put a little bit in, you're going to run out of gas pretty soon, and you're going to be going on fumes, and you're likely to burn out. But if you fill that tank up and then know how to continue to fill that tank up throughout a lifetime, you're more likely to be more effective, avoid more mistakes, and at the end be much more satisfied with the work God does through you.
I appreciate that. I grew up in a tradition called the Churches of Christ, which is very fundamentalist and views the scripture in a certain way, views lots of different people a certain way, and the way they view them is that they're not going to be the ones in heaven. We're going to be the ones in heaven, and very anti-intellectual and very nobody's going to sort of tell us what to think or decide for us what to think about scripture or God, and there's some of that I get, but I've also seen strong personalities who are very charismatic and great or attractive people who could lead a lot of people in certain ways, destroy congregations of people because of some of the things that they didn't get that people who went through a seminary or a very structured program of theological education receive that type of training. So I often use that example of, I've witnessed people who are anti-intellectual or anti-education hurt people and traumatize people in ways that they probably wouldn't have done had they had certain training or skills that they were taught in. And so, yeah.
Fortunately, that never happens in holiness and Pentecostal traditions. That's only your.
Yeah, right.
I'd like to add something to that. I mean, there's a sense in which, we go to doctors or we go to a law office and we encounter people who have taken the time to invest, to train themselves, to work on our bodies or on our heads or on our airplanes or whatever the case might be. And, for those of us who do have that calling to serve in the church or to serve God in some way, then don't we deserve to at least give ourselves the opportunity to receive some kind of training that can help us to be the best that we can, if that's what we expect of everybody else whose services we might want to solicit or patronize to help us in our work. So,
yeah, theologians, to carry your analogy a little further, used to be called the doctors of the church. And
what
so
happened
that's
to those days?
I don't know. So there's something about training for that doctorate so you can be more helpful that's important, I think.
Right. It's not an elitist thing. I'm investing my time and energy in a way that is going to make me a better leader or a better practitioner of the type of soul care that I'm going to provide. And I liked when you said, people who made or build airplanes. We don't want some version of homebrew Christianity for airline pilots. And I'm not knocking what Tripp does. I think that gives us great access, people access that they didn't have. But the ones that are building those planes, we don't want them getting that off the internet, or we don't want them just listening to a podcast. And then we're talking about people whose lives are affected, and that needs to be done in a way that has some sort of structure and accountability built into it and things like that. So, yeah, that's wonderful.
And when you're shepherding a congregation, people's lives are at stake.
Yes, absolutely. So, last question. I really appreciate you all doing this for us. How do you think theological or theology, because I think theology can be done, it can be practiced. How do you think it's going to be done differently in the decades to come than it has been up until this point? If you don't have an answer, it's fine.
The hatchery.
There you go.
I think people are going to be bivocational. I think there are doctors and social workers and nurses who want theological education so that they can do their own work better and they can do specialized ministries better. It's going to be entrepreneurial. People are going to plant churches in different ways, not with steeples and pews, but with healthy growing farms and environmental ministries and all kinds of ways that we can be of service in the world. I think that theological education needs to retool itself so that it can better serve the ministry that are arising, the new ministries that are arising.
Before we move on, would you think about, or would you say that institutions of theological education need to think about access differently than we have before? So who can access this type of training that we're talking about instead of going through other channels or avenues that haven't been tested? Yeah.
It's access, it's viability, it's being a living, viable institution, not one that was built years ago and still doing the same things it's always done. It means there has to be change in the accreditation processes. It means that people have to teach differently and use different ways to deliver theological education, not just in a classroom, but online and in small groups. So it's all going to change.
So
and isn't that great?
Yeah, things like United and Phillips Seminary are doing, just to throw that in there, No,
I really like that. I mean, there's a sense in which we are attempting to discern the nature of the future church, which is, of course, paradoxical in itself, because that's the whole point about it being the future church. We can't quite see what it's going to be like. So it's kind of like trying to train people for something that doesn't yet exist, and in which we ourselves are not quite sure what that looks like. I think that's part of the challenge. You know, the nature of the church is going forward. I think the other thing that makes it complicated is then something that's not just a theological education challenge, but it's a higher education challenge. You know, the changing shape of knowledge and the information age and what that means for all of us. So it's not just about the fact that you might be able to get some schemes off of the internet with regard to building an airplane, but it's about how we discern, how we engage, how the different perspectives. So building an airplane might be a more structured kind of activity, but imagining the future nature of the church might be a lot more open-ended. And in that respect, there might be a case to be made about how theological education need to be more attentive to a wide spectrum of innovators, a wide spectrum of guessers, a wide spectrum of entrepreneurs, a wide spectrum of et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, in the 21st century, with all of our mediated technologies and globalization and all of those dynamics, there's so many different dimensions to churches with regard to space, time, ethnicity, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that the scope of conversation partners that we need to bring into the mix is in many respects unmanageable. And in that respect, then theological educators are those who might need to facilitate the appropriate conversations in the appropriate spaces and times for these kinds of tasks, these kinds of outcomes.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think what I have to say was probably kind of been said already, but I want to say it in a different way. The conversation in a lot of higher ed theological education is on delivery systems. What's the best way to educate, and what are the various means by which to do that? A long time ago, the great Marshall McLuhan says the medium is the message. And when I was in seminary, that meant the medium was an individual stood in front of the classroom. I had eye contact with that person. That person pretty much lectured. There was very little discussion. And I wrote a paper, and that's how I was graded on whether or not I was a good theologian or understood the material. In a world in which social media is so widespread, I think the message is probably going to change some in terms of what theological education entails. And then, therefore, those who will be seen as the most fruitful, the most influential, the most persuasive are going to be those who understand how to use the social media in ways to educate theologically. And that is still an ongoing question mark, what that looks like.
I think theology is going to have to expand to include all meaning structures and not just Christian meaning structures, right? Like, I think the dollar bill or the dollar sign is just as important as a cross, right, in terms of the production of meaning in this society. So that I think theologians need to take seriously that we don't live in like kind of discrete Christianized worlds, that they're interactive and we hold many worldviews at once. And that if we're going to be effective in theology, we're going to have to discern the kind of entanglements that Christians in the kind of postmodern context live in, and really explore much more symbols of meaning than just kind of ancient Christian ones.
Yeah. There's a physicist called Paul Davies. I don't know if you've come across him. He writes popular works on science. And he says that actually it's very strange that Christians have stopped talking about God and physicists have started to talk about God. And they could get together.